check if this is on. Is it on? Okay. Welcome to Senior Moments Celebrated. After this presentation, we will invite comments, questions, and maybe even memories from the floor, if you have them. All of us, each and every one of us, have stories worth sharing. Often we shrug off inner prompts because we lack time, motivation, confidence, enthusiasm, energy, or whatever. This afternoon, our panel of seniors is ready to share memories to take us back, way back, to the 1950s and the 1940s, and even further in some cases. Our country's president was Franklin D. Roosevelt from 1938 to 1942. Some of our panel were born in the 1930s, when the average price for a gallon of gas was 10 cents. In 1935, the average cost for a new house was $4,100. In the 1940s, when World War II was raging, duct tape was invented, designed to wrap around and keep water out of ammunition cases. Ballpoint pens were invented, instant coffee was introduced, and penicillin and sulfa became more widely available. Lucy, our youngest panel member, recalls when a box of Royal Jello cost 8 cents. The idea for this panel came about when my sister Joanna turned 80 in January, in the dead of winter and the dread of COVID. Not ideal conditions for a birthday party. So the panel consists of Joanna and cousins, except for Elaine, who we claim by association. Elaine's grandparents, Alvin and Martha Yoder, lived on the property where our Grandpa Miller and Aunt Kate lived, so Elaine was often present when Joanna visited her grandpa. Kenneth and Ruth Yoder now live in the farmhouse where Elaine's grandparents lived. Well, where to start with our panel?
Wookie! Wookie!
You have just heard our dairy maids calling the cows to the barn for milking. Everyone on this panel grew up on a dairy farm. But before going any further, introductions are in order. I am Ruth Miller Yoder, daughter of the late Ivan J. and Della Miller. And then Joanna, we will start with you and end with Lucy.
I am Joanna Miller, daughter of Ivan J. and Della Miller. That means I'm a sister to Ruth, who had the bright idea for this gathering today. And we grew up on Maple Shade Farm, which is between here and Grantsville, just up the hill. Our farm lane goes right beside that new airplane hangar for the airstrip, and our farm lane is right beside that. That's where we grew up.
I am Fannie Bender. My parents were Omer and Myra Maust, and I grew up, was born and raised at a small farm next to the original Oakdale Church, near St. Paul, which boasted of but one church house, a school, a Sybil's convenience store, Mark Maust's garage, and it had one gasoline pump.
I'm Ida Yoder, My parents were Ernest and Lena Yoder and lived right down the road from Fannie. What was the name of our farm?
Log cabin.
Log Cabin Farm. There used to be a log cabin on our farm, and we played in there quite a bit.
I'm Freda Yoder. I'm a sister to Ida and first cousin to the rest of the ladies except for Elaine. My mother was a sister to Ruth and Fannie's mother, Ruth, Fannie, and Lucy's mother. So we were together quite a bit, but more often I think we spent time with Aunt Myra's family, who lived up the road from there. We were back and forth all the time.
I'm Elaine Yoder. My parents were Ruth and Raymond Tice, and I grew up on the farm on Tice Road off of Maple Grove Road out at the Casselman. And but before that, when Mom and Dad were first married, they lived up here at where is Goodwill Mennonite Home now, and I lived there until I was 2.5. And my dad used to kid me. Said, you started out there, you'll probably end up there. Probably true. I live at Accident now, and I've worked at Goodwill Home for quite a few years.
Well, I'm Lucy Beachy Maust. My parents were Simon and Berta Beachy, and as far as I was concerned, I grew up in the center of the universe, which was in Iverton. There used to be a town there. It was a coal mining town. There were a lot of houses and a dance floor and a store and whatever. My mother used to talk about going there to buy things for her mother. But that all burned down except for 2 houses. But did I say enough now?
I think you
Okay.
did for now.
Okay.
We'll hear more later. So let's start with childhood, some memories of childhood. Fannie, your sister Mildred is 92 years old now, and recently she was recalling the little horses she used to play with. Can you tell us more?
Yes, I don't recall it myself, but yes, she and I think maybe some of the other family, I'm not certain about that, but they used baler twine to make harness for twin little cousins they had. And they hooked them up to a very small wagon and, of course, had them pull them around.
And who were those little twin cousins?
Evan and Ivan Maust.
So Fannie, you also mentioned you're younger than Mildred. You had few toys, but you knew how to create your own fun. Give us an example.
Well, I think where I spent most of my time, and I think where I learned to be somewhat creative at least, was in the sandbox. We built houses, we built rivers, we put in trees, had little villages and roads, the whole bit. I really enjoyed that. And also, my dad had built us a swing, a rope swing with a wooden seat under an apple tree. And I spent lots of times there too. Of course, we had dolls and we had the cutouts and
Well, your mother did quite a bit of sewing, and so there were a lot of wooden spools that became empty. What did you do with the wooden spools?
we dressed them up as families and we played with the wooden spools.
Okay, do we have any wooden spool family here today?
I should have brought
We
some.
don't have them,
No.
but we can imagine. Okay. So you mentioned there were some other pastimes like cutting out people from catalogs. Did any of the rest of you play with paper people? Lucy, go
yes.
first.
Oh, yes, it was a great day when a new Sears or Montgomery Ward catalog would come, because that meant we could take the old one and we could cut out people. We made families, a father, mother, and as many children as we wanted. And it was just a great day, but even then the catalogs weren't usually thrown away because they were used to stack on top of each other for children who couldn't reach the table right. So they sat on the catalogs.
Okay. Joanne?
And we played with people for endless hours. My sister Miriam and Ruth and I especially played together a lot. Once in a while, our older sisters would help us, and they helped us cut out the finer points of cutting out people from the catalog sometimes. And we spent a lot of time on the table, our dining room table, which we called the kitchen table, and we often played there. Sometimes we played upstairs, and if we played quietly, we might not be called down right away, and we could keep playing. And if we stayed very quiet, then my little sister Dorcas, who was too young to know how to play with paper people, in Leitchfield, we played people, quote unquote, in Pennsylvania Dutch, in Leitchfield. So I really liked it that one of the things we did was make a car for the people out of a cereal box. You cut off the one side, and then you fold the benches like we have folded up here, wherever the people are down here. And then you sit the people on those, and so you had the front seat and the back seat of a car. Cars had bench seats only then, in that day. And then we would take them to church, and of course, when they went to church, the women sat on one side and the men on the other side. And then we also went to Sunday school, and I also liked to line up my people to take a family picture. And Ruth was more adventurous. She was always more adventurous. And Ruth decided that there was just not enough excitement in going to church and taking pictures. And she decided that we didn't call it a community picnic, but we were going to have a community picnic. And she decided that it would be the edge of the table was a cliff. And so there was this major danger of what was going to happen to the kids. And before anybody heard of seat belts in a car, I decided I was going to have a safety belt for my children because she kept taking my children over to the edge of the cliff. So I decided on safety belts, and Ruth said, there can be only one safety belt per family. And of course the families, Lucy said we could have as many children as we wanted. We wanted a lot of children. And so I could have only one safety belt. And I never had a time that I could have a chance to take any of her kids to the cliff because she was so busy taking my children, having my children run over to the cliff. And then one day we were upstairs playing in the room that was Rachel and Ruth's room, and there's an east window. Usually the wind comes more from the west, and the window was open, and we were inside the window, and it was a rainy day, and accidentally my grandma flew out the window. Perhaps with a little help. And by the time I brought her in, she was rain-soaked and she was not in very good condition, but a thing we could do in those days before we had, I'm not sure if we still had the stove then, but earlier, if the paper people got crumpled, you could wet them, smooth them out on the wood and coal stove that we had before we had an electric stove. And you could, if you put it where it wasn't too hot, you could smooth it out on there and it would dry fairly flat. But Ruth decided that there was really no help for this grandma. It was time for a funeral. So this is typical of the way life went for me when I was a child.
I think we better go to another subject. So playing church with paper people was one way we played church, but church was very much a part of our lives.
Yeah.
And so there was more than one way to play church. And we played church one day. There were some girl cousins who were over at Fannie's house, and Fannie lived next to where the original Oakdale Church House was. And so on this day, there was a little group of little girls decided to go over to the Oakdale Church House to play church. And Freda, maybe I'll let you tell the story from there.
Well, when you played church, there were different kinds of church activities, of course. We decided it was going to be a day for weddings. And so we had to have all the key players, and we had, I guess there were 6 of us there. It would have been 2 of Fannie's younger sisters, Lucy and her sister Esther, and Eleanor and I, no, there were 7 of us, my sister Eleanor and Delilah and I. And so we had to have all the characters, of course, too. And so I didn't volunteer to play my role, but I was kind of drafted into that role, I think.
Don't believe that.
But Eleanor and Esther were the bride and groom. Lucy and Delilah were Navajo on one side,
Like witnesses.
and that means witnesses, yes. And on the other side were Fannie's 2 sisters, Ruth and Neoma. They were the Navajo, and I was the preacher. Like I say, I was drafted into that role, not that I chose that role. But so the preacher had the prerogative to make up the vows, of course. So they had to be very meaningful. And so I blurted out, "Verspreche dir von miteinander mischt vor." Of course, we conducted our services in Pennsylvania Dutch at that time.
You have to translate.
And so that's the Pennsylvania Dutch. Verspreche dir von miteinander mischt vor means, do you promise to haul manure together? And of course they both said, "I do, ich do, I do, ich do." And but they never, as far as I know, Esther and Eleanor never hauled manure together. But when Eleanor got married, before she got married, I think she and that Ralph hauled manure together. That's her husband. And when they got married, we made a quilt for them, with all the cousins doing a block like was traditional back then. And in addition to that, we had these 3 patches that Ida crocheted. And
No, I embroidered them.
you embroidered them, right? She embroidered them, and we put them together for a pillow top. So you all can look at that, and it has the vowel there, and then it has the response, and it's kind of self-explanatory.
So anyway, that story has long circulated among the cousins, and we thought at our age it's about time that we share it with some of the rest of the public here today.
Yeah, that was one thing they never let me forget.
So Fannie, you sometimes played church on your porch steps too, is that right?
We did. We had porch steps. There were probably 6 steps on the wooden porch. And of course, my sisters, I have 4 sisters, and we all had dolls to play with, but my one brother didn't. And so my father built him a small bench, and he would set the bench on end and use it for his little buddy.
So that, the little bench was Clifford's little boy.
Yeah.
So that was a very innovative way to, and we talked about, there were, of course, sandboxes and swings on porches, swings out under the trees. But there were also some other places where there was good play and relaxation and fun. Ida, your place had a creek. Can you describe that for us?
Well, the creek went down below the barn and the house, and right down from the barn, it was almost as wide as this church, not quite maybe. And the rocks were all very flat. The water was only 2 or 3 inches deep. So we played down there a lot. We went barefooted, and Fannie and her siblings would come down, and those of us who were not old enough to have to work all day went down there, and we played a lot. And then sometimes we went on up the creek and did some fishing where the water was deeper and the fish were much more, there were a lot more fish up there. There were no fish really that we ever saw when it was flat, except maybe some very tiny ones. I think
Minnows.
very little minnows, but there were no big ones on the flat place where we played, but we had a lot of fun in the creek.
So the fishing, oh, excuse me, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, tell them what you used for a fishing pole.
Oh, Freda, she brought a sample of what everybody used. There it
Well, it was
is.
more or less, excuse me, Elaine. Sorry. That's okay. This was an improvised fishing pole. We didn't have a lot of money back then, and so we had to kind of be improvise. Now, the younger kids didn't have the real fishing hooks. I think maybe my older brothers might have had some. But we would make our own. This is not exactly the twine we got out of our feed bags, but we were on a farm, so we always had feed for our cattle, you know. And the string on the top, we'd pull that out and we'd save it and roll it up into a ball. And we saved it and used it for a lot of things. So that was our fish line. And for a hook, I used straight pins and bend the tip into the shape of a hook. And believe it or not, I caught a lot of fish that way.
Yeah, we did.
And,
We had the weight on there too.
well, sometimes I would put a weight on, sometimes I didn't. Or if there was an extra, what'd you call them, those things,
Bobber?
Corks.
corks around,
Cork.
I would maybe do that for a bobber. But I would collect the baits, either, sometimes I would get earthworms under rocks or dig for them with a shovel. And other times I would just simply go down into our meadow and get grasshoppers. And the tiny green grasshoppers were really the best bait. But we caught quite a few fish that way. Sometimes they were big enough to eat. Mostly they were more like 4 to 6 inches in length. But the bigger ones, if we got anything bigger, we would eat them sometimes. And they were probably trout, but they had scales. So we'd have to scrape off the scales and clean out the insides. And sometimes our dad helped us fish if we had a lot, or clean the fish if we had a lot. And then we would roll them in flour and saute them in beef tallow. And we made our own beef tallow from suet. From when we butchered our cattle, we would save the suet and then render it for the tallow, and we'd use that as a cooking oil or whatever. We didn't use as much lard as some people did, but it's the same principle. You use the suet from the animal and you render it, and it was really pretty tasty.
You almost make us hungry.
Dave caught one that
and
was
then-
18 inches long once,
Yeah,
but that was down the creek a ways.
that was a different stream. He caught a big one, 18.25 inches, he says.
Pretty big.
Yeah.
So Ida, you also said that you had a lot of elderberries on your farm.
Oh, we did, and
What
we
did you-
picked a lot of them. We sold them for 50 cents a bushel, I think. We took them to Newman's feed store in West Salisbury. He bought them at 50 cents a bushel, and we picked as many bushels as we could. I don't know how many bushels we picked, but they grew in our orchard as well as down in the bottom where there's now a dam, and along the field, along the fences. So we picked a lot of elderberries back then.
And we used the elderberry stalk. That's what we used for our fishing poles.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Very innovative. Lucy, your sister Esther was 6 years older than you, and so sometimes you played alone. Tell us about your post office and what was the other thing you had? And the bank, yes.
Yeah, I was the manager, or the owner of the First International Bank of Cattsville. My co-owner was Tom Sawyer, who was my cat. But I played with kittens. My, I played with kittens. I would dress them up in doll clothes, and when Mama didn't find out, I would go to the medicine cabinet and I would take out pills and I would crush them and I'd put them in a little bottle with milk or something, and I'd feed them. And the cats all died, but I don't think I killed any of them. But yeah, I would have been lost without my kittens to play with. But then Delilah, after her mother died, their sister Delilah would come up to my place a lot. And then our favorite thing to play was Little Pig, Let Me Come In. And
Up by the hair.
the house was under the table. and Delilah and I would take turns being the wolf or the pig, and we would be up on this bar stool kind of thing, and we would literally go head first in onto the table, because that's the way the wolf went down the chimney. Yeah, we just improvised a lot like that. But one thing that my older cousins did to Delilah and I, especially in Yuma too, they would take, when they played church, they would take these little medicine bottles, with the liquid medicine in them, they were empty, and they would fill them up with chocolate milk, and then they would screw the lids on, but not tight. And then they would hold us on their laps, we'd lay down, and I remember laying there, and we'd drink out of these bottles. And why those lids never popped off and choked us, I don't know. But that was the best chocolate syrup I've never had, and it was just like that, chocolate milk. So.
Okay, let's switch gears now a little bit to family vacations. Family vacations were rare for us farming families. Going to conference in August was a big thing for some of our families. Someone had to stay home, though, to do the chores, and truthfully, no matter how big the car was, it probably wasn't big enough to accommodate the whole family. So not everybody usually went to conference, but Joanna, can you sort of paint the picture for conference time?
When conference was anywhere else, it was a hot trip usually. There was no air conditioning in any of our cars. I don't, earlier in my early years, none of us had, no one had air conditioning. And I'm not saying it didn't exist somewhere in the world, but not with normal people. And so it was always a hot trip. But when we did go to conference, in other places, we always stayed with a host family, someone else from the congregations that was sponsoring it, or from other Mennonites in the community. So it was regularly, we did not stay in motels. We stayed with families who were part of the host congregation. When conference was held here, which back in those years was about every 10 years, we had a huge tent out here close to where we put the tent now for Bible school, and so on, a bigger tent, a very large tent. Parking was over here where the Goodwill Retirement Village is now, and the other field on the other side of the road. And food was served in the basement here. The food was not catered by some organization in a college or at like places where it's held now in some kind of a civic center or something, but the food was served here in the basement. All the food was provided by people from Oakdale, Maple Glen, and Cherry Glade, who were the conference churches here in the area. And all of us helped to serve the food. Young people from the youth group, children, all of us helped to put food on the plates on different days. Different people did it. Some people probably every day. But all of the food was just served in the basement here. A lot of people took it outside to the tent to eat. There really wasn't room for the whole tent full of people to eat in the basement. So a lot of people took it to the tent or sat on the grass outside to eat. But it was the setting for conference was quite different from what it is. Again, no air conditioning in that tent either. So it was either hot if it was in Illinois or Iowa or some such place. And if it was here, sometimes people got very chilly at night if the temperature went down into the upper 50s. Other people weren't always prepared for that. So word was kind of out that if you come to Grantsville, bring some warmer clothes with you for sitting in the tent at night. Also, if conference was in Delaware, the Bay Bridge was not yet there. So when we went to Delaware for a conference, we crossed on the ferry, drive the car onto the ferry, and then you could get out of the car and walk around on the ferry, and then when you get to the other side, you drive the car off on the other side. So that was always an interesting experience if we went there. And often when we went to Belleville, Pennsylvania, if conference was there, we stayed with either my we didn't always stay at Uncle Harvey's house because all the other Miller aunts and uncles who went to conference also were there. And we sometimes stayed with one of Aunt Mildred's Byler relatives in that area, or with some other family. It was not always someone that we knew well before we went, but often it was, if it was in those places. But wherever a conference was, practically everybody in the church had overnight guests. And the same was true when it was here. Almost everyone had guest rooms. And at our house, we would sleep on the floor to make room for more people to have a bed to sleep in. We didn't mind having a butter nest, a floor nest, a place on the floor to sleep. That just it was sort of like camping at home to do that.
So, and Ida, I remember you saying that you never really went on a family vacation except one. There was one special vacation. Tell us about that.
Yes, we got up early in the morning, did all the chores, fed the cattle and the chickens and everything. Then we took off to Pittsburgh to the zoo. And we went in the old Graham car, it was pretty wide, but there were 9 of us in it. And I think there was a Bentley on each side of the back seats where Freda and Eleanor would have sat. And the rest of us sat, I guess, in a real seat.
And a Bentley is a little stool.
Bentley is a little stool, yeah, for the smallest ones. But there were 9 of us in the car, and we went all the way to Pittsburgh. I think it was about 3 hours going and coming, probably. Then in the evening, we came back, and we had to do all the chores again. But
Yeah.
it was a really fun day.
And one you never forgot.
Right.
Yeah.
Ruth, can I say one thing about conference?
Yeah.
There was no such thing as registration. You had no idea how many people were going to come. And the lodging committee was very busy, very busy. One of my first memories, or most impressionable memories of conference as a little girl, was sitting in that huge tent. And after the service would start, and I don't think they had children's meetings back then, did they?
No, not
I
the
don't
first year,
remember.
no.
But I remember that often while we were singing the first or second song, then all these preachers would come in they'd been in a preacher's meeting somewhere. And they were all there with their white shirts and they're carrying their briefcases. And they would look for their wives, and the wives usually were sitting along the edge or around the front. And I just thought they looked like such important people.
So now let's switch gears again. Elaine, thinking about the sewing, the sewing circle, which we didn't call it the sewing circle, but for purposes of people better understanding, the sewing circle. Where was the first sewing you attended, and about how old were you?
Well, the first sewing I went to, at that time the sewings were held in the houses. Elaine Yoder was the president. Her husband was Urban Yoder, but we all knew him as Barney. I didn't know he had a name Urban for a long time. But it was at her house, which is on the other side of Goodwill, that farm that people from Goodwill always watch. They think it's so beautiful. It was in her house. I don't think I went to school yet, so I'm not sure exactly how old I was. And I was born in 45, and I've been reading Esther's diaries, and I saw where in 1945 they were cutting material for the sewing. And in 46, she went to sewing, and Salome took their picture. So I expect Mom was going to sewing then and took me from the time I was a baby, but I do remember going there. Marietta, Salome's daughter, and I were good friends, and I enjoyed going to their house. Their house was a big house. It was a house I liked to go to. It gave me a good feeling to go into that house. It was an old house, I knew that, but it just was a good feeling. The kitchen was a big kitchen. It had an old-fashioned cook stove in it, plus an electric stove. It was an eat-in kitchen. Of course, they didn't know to call it an eat-in kitchen in those days, but it had a big table that the family ate their meals at. And between the kitchen and dining room was a big cupboard. And on the dining room side, the top doors of the cupboard had glass in, and that's where she kept her nice dishes that she used when she had company. The bottom of that cupboard was where the toys were. So we kids became acquainted with that spot.
Yeah.
And Salome was a quiet person as I remember her, but she really had a green thumb. And she had so many beautiful flowers. And I remember her big ferns and geraniums and all kinds of flowers that she had in the house, but also outside. She had the most beautiful flower beds outside. And so in this dining room, that was just a very cozy kind of place to be. They usually had a couch in there, I think, and her flowers and her sewing machine and table. And that's where the women would set up their sewing machines when they sewed. The living room was separate, and it was a pretty good sized room. And what I remembered the most about the living room, it impressed me. Right inside the door along the wall was a row of hooks to hang your coats and hats and such things on. But they also would set up a comforter in that room, and then if they needed more room, there were quite a few bedrooms upstairs, and they'd set comforters up upstairs too. I don't know how many years the sewing was there, but it was quite a few years that Salome was president, and the sewing was always at her house.
And then who became president after Salome?
After they appointed a new president, it was my grandma Martha.
Yes.
And she lived across the hill here, where Kenneth and Ruth Yoder live now. Grandma's house wasn't near as big as Salome's house, but Grandma's house was very adequate to my mind as a child. It was just, I had no idea how small Grandma's house was till I became an adult and had people, families of my own. But Grandma's house was a kitchen, not an eat-in kitchen. There was no table in the kitchen, but the dining room was the table. And then she usually had a couch in the dining room. Grandpa's roll-top desk was there. She had, her father had made her a big hutch, which was in the dining room. And so it wasn't a very big room, table in the middle. But there was a heap of living happening in that dining room.
I think it's bigger than you think it was, because I remember when I was there for dinner, it was a long table. There may not have been extra space, but
there wasn't
there
much
was a
space around them. Well, then their living room, that was off limits to us kids for the most part. Through the week, we weren't allowed in the living room. We could have called it a parlor. Grandpa loved to visit with people, so that was off limits, and it was always really nice. I thought that was the most beautiful place in there. But we weren't allowed in, but when company came, they had that room all ready, and Grandpa could take in there whoever he wanted to visit with, and it was always really nice. So, and upstairs were 4 bedrooms, and one of the bedrooms was fixed up pretty nice too. It was the guest room, the spare room it was called. And so it was always ready for company in case they had overnight guests. As I remember, that was where Grandma stored the supplies for sewing in between sewing times. I remember seeing the quilt frames along the wall, on the floor along the wall, and there was a cedar chest there that had boxes setting on it. I don't know what happened to this when they did have company, but The women that were sewing were set up in the dining room then, and they did set one up in the living room too, I think. And somewhere I read that, found out just recently that Grandma was president of the sewing for about 8 years, that she had it.
So that was a long time in the mind of a child. for
Yeah,
us
well,
today.
it seemed like most of my life.
Yeah, yes, yes, yes. One of the things we talked about when we were trying to sort of figure out what do we eliminate and what do we add in, somebody said we didn't have much, but we didn't know it. So I was thinking about gifts. We talked a little bit about gifts. If given at all, we're usually very practical and by today's standards, very modest. When something unusual then was given, it was, you held it very dear. Now, Irma, my and Joanna's 93-year-old sister-in-law, still thrills over a spectacular gift that she and her sister Arlene shared one Christmas. Their parents gave them a year's subscription to the Mennonite Publishing House publication for children, Beams of Light. This weekly paper cost 30 cents a year. And there's a copy of that on one of the tables. One of Irma's Beams of Light is on the table here somewhere. You're welcome to look at that afterwards. Fannie, what gifts do you recall?
Well, I do remember the words of cheer and beams of light. We also received those, and we will look so forward to receiving them. I remember the earliest gifts were an orange or the nuts. I'll never forget the nuts that we had
Christmas
at
gifts.
Christmas time as a
Yeah.
Christmas gift. Yes,
Yeah.
and we get crayons or a coloring book. I remember one year, as I was a little older, I received a pillowcase that was Mother used the pillowcase, was almost worn through. And she cut it up in smaller pieces, and we could use that as a fabric to do some embroidery on it. And she taught us how to do it with a little embroidery ring, and we did that. Those are the early gifts that were really a treasure.
And you treasured them,
Yes.
didn't you?
Yes.
And you used some of that fabric to make your people.
Yes,
with-
scraps of paper, fabric that when she sewed, we could use the scraps to
To make people out of
decorate
the-
our people
the
and
wooden,
dress them.
wooden
The
spools,
Yes.
yes. And Fannie explained that you knew it was a man when it was dark clothes, and the ladies and children were dressed in a little more flowery outfits or
lighter.
lighter outfits. So Lucy, you had a couple gifts too that that stay in your memory.
Yeah, for as long as I can remember, I wanted a train, and Papa would always say, well, if you'd be a boy, I'd get you a train. Well, I couldn't help it, I wasn't a boy, I still wanted a train. So when I was 9 years old, I got my train. Oh, I was so pleased with that train. And another gift I received that year that I still use today at Christmas time was a little handkerchief that my Uncle Norman Beachy brought back from the Holy Land tour, and it said Bethlehem on it. And I think that was the first year that I really made the connection in my mind that this Bethlehem is an actual place. It's not just a place in a storybook, but it's an actual place, and my Uncle Norman was there. So I have this Bethlehem village that I always put out at Christmas time, and I fold that handkerchief, it was written on the corner, and underneath there, there's pretty flowers, and it says Bethlehem. And that's two of the gifts that I remember very well.
Yes. We talked too about sickness. It seemed that sickness made its rounds over and over in our families when we were younger. There were not the medications and the treatments that are available now. So sometimes on on Sundays or Saturday night during the night, one of us would get sick. And our father would call the doctor Sunday, and the doctor would say he'll put the tablets, the pills, he'd put them in a little envelope, put them out on the porch, and my father would go pick them up. Now, can you imagine that? But it worked then. Lucy, you have a record somewhere of a hospital bill. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was in 1953. I had my tonsils removed. The room and board at the hospital was $7.50 a day, and Papa paid Dr. Salasco $25 for doing the surgery.
For doing tonsillectomy, so that's where we might want to go. To have Thinking a little bit about the youth group and hopefully moving right along here. Sunday evenings were a big deal. Cherry Glade, Oakdale, and Maple Glen, the youth all joined together in one youth group. Tell us about the singings.
Well, we would, I don't know whether people invited us in or if somebody would ask which home we're going to, but at least we'd be invited to families of the church to their home in the evening, and we'd sing in the dining room generally around the table from the life songs, the church hymnal, and the church Sunday school hymnal. And that was our Sunday evening youth activity for many years.
Recreation, but also
Yes.
Spiritual
Yes. Yeah.
in nature, yes. Our family has sort of an inside joke that I guess here's a good place to tell you. One time in the 60s, I think it was, there was a singing over here where Luella Yoder lived, beside where Don Opal now lives, but Luella's house is gone. And during that time, somebody would be designated to have a short devotional and have a prayer before the singing. And then, he wasn't our brother-in-law Monroe then, but he had his eye on our sister Rachel. And often the first dates happened after singings. So he had planned to ask Rachel for a date, and he had this on his mind instead of the devotional like he should have been doing. So when it came time to pray, and at that singing, and as was the case for us usually, we would be standing. There would be pretty much standing room only. So Monroe has the devotions.
This one was outside.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe it was an outside,
It was an outside
singing.
singing.
We were standing. We were standing. And Monroe's ready to pray, and he says, "Shall we kneel to pray?" So we never let Monroe forget that. There were other times we had singings too. What was a surprise singing?
And someone turned
Lucy.
21.
When someone turned 21, there was a surprise singing for that person, and it usually was not on the birthday because then that person would suspect it. So there was a lot of attention given to trying to keep it a secret, and it was after the singing, I think there were always refreshments too. And there were other times when we would have singings too. If a relative or visitors came through the community, to the community, often we would honor them with singings too. But I would like to move to a separate category now, corn huskings. And I think we were a little bit at the tail end of that, but Fannie, you and Ida would be able to sort of take us to a corn husking.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Do you want- Well, the farmers would cut their corn with a machine, which would bind them like a sheath you see these days in the fields with the Amish friends, and then they would put them all together in a shock. So they at time would want the corn to be husked and invite the young people to come. Of course, this was a fall, cool evening, and sometimes very cold, that we would gather to do that. And I don't know, but it seemed like the guys took an opportunity to ask a girl to husk with him. That was a big thing at that time. And the saying was, now I don't know where it came from, but if you found a red ear, he could kiss the girl he was husking with.
And somebody said that one of the farmers then planted a lot of red ears. Whether that's true, I don't really know. But it was always, it seemed like it was always a cold night, and it wasn't necessarily it wasn't always couples that were husking together.
No.
As you said, often there were maybe 6 or 7 girls.
Yeah, probably
around.
7 or 8 people, maybe all girls, maybe some of each.
Yes.
Around one big place. And after that, we always had a big feast.
It was
Yeah.
a big meal,
Yes.
actually.
And Eleanor said she remembers there was a corn husking at
Lee
Lee
Shepherd.
Sheffel's, and they had corn for part of the meal. And so they had a quart jar of
Corn on the cob.
butter where you dipped your corn and cob in, and then you ate it.
Oh,
And I actually had, Orrin and I had one of our first dates on, after corn husking up here at Ivan's farm, right up here on the hill.
so let's move from fall to winter now. Nearly every family had at least one sled, and sled riding was a lot of fun for every family. Lucy, did you do sled riding over at Crossroads?
Oh, my, yes. I went to the Crossroads School. Our house was actually halfway between Crossroads School and the Amish Church House, the Niverton Church House. Actually, it was a flag run, but it's called Niverton too. And so, of course, I had to walk to school, but we would take our sleds and start up at the top of the hill, and down we would go, just a-flying. And my mother would tell me that she always knew when I was going because Jane was sitting on top of me, or lying on top of me. Did you lay down or sit on me? I just know I got her there. She's the only one really I remember studying with at school. But then sometimes, some of the older boys would bring a pickup to school. And then they would come down with their pickup, and we would just hook our sleds to the back of the pickup, and they'd take us back up the hill. Down we'd go again. So we did that at school. And then at home, we did it down past our barn, and it was always so much fun when Mama would go with us after chores. And once in a while, Papa would go, but Mama just loved sledding. She loved sledding and swing riding, and that was just always a real special treat.
And can I add what we used to do too? Is there time for that? Okay, and then we also would go up, our lane was up here, and then we'd just go a little farther to the top of the hill and come down what's now called Dorsey Hotel Road, and we would come all the way down, and if you could make the turn up here at the corner, you did. If you couldn't, you went on in there. But if you could make the turn, you could come all the way down here to Maple Glen, and sometimes part way around the Strawberry Hill Farm, which is now the Goodwill Home curve down here. So, and this was on a public road, but there would be, if when we had sled riding parties, if the youth group came, or some of our neighbors, sometimes Elmer Maust, when they lived over here at where Goodwill is now, and other people would come, and sometimes a group of us would be having a sledding party in the evening, and somebody would be watching and would yell, "Car," if there was a car coming. But can you imagine a group of kids sled riding on this public road these days? Of course, they salt it now and melt the snow, but it used to be good sledding from all the way on the top, all the way down.
Sled riding or whatever, on a public road at night.
It was very bright often, even though the snow reflected. Now, rather quickly, Joanna, because we are really running out of time here, practicing for the Christmas program, there was no beautiful sound system or guys up there who understood how to bring our voices to the right pitch. How did that work without a sound system?
It works to have the right kind of ants. All right, Miller aunts in particular, and Aunt Alma Maust, Miller Maust, would sit in the back, on the back bench back there, and we had to project our voices enough, even if we were preschool, we had to project enough that she could hear every word, and the other aunts too, and it was helpful to have that. And also at home, we would practice. We had to go into the bedroom, close the door, into our parents' bedroom, close the door, so the person in the kitchen could hear us say our verses, and so loudly and slowly enough. And Jane Bender's sisters, a little older than Jane too, they all also projected very well, and they didn't have the Miller aunts, so I'm not sure how they did it. But someone at their house also coached them for sure. And we all had to do it without any microphones.
So our Christmas program back in those days was Christmas morning. And Lucy, you had a sort of a tradition on December 24. Tell us about that.
Yeah, we'd have a practice, first, like early afternoon, we'd have their final practice for the program, and then we'd go home, and that's when we would make the popcorn balls. And while we were shaping those popcorn balls, Mama would recite to us, "'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse." And she would go through that whole thing. And she never believed in Santa Claus, but she sure entertained us with that.
Up the hill from us is Goodwill Mennonite Home, and the doors there opened in 1959. Leona Maust was not able to be here with us, one of our Miller cousins, but she was one of the early workers. She worked as an aide. She also did cleaning. She worked in the kitchen. She worked in the laundry, and the laundry was done on a wringer washer. And she used a mangle iron to iron the bed sheets. And she remembered lugging baskets of laundry up the steps. So eventually, Goodwill had 2 floors with occupancy totaling 23 residents. Still no elevators. So how would you transport residents between the floors? And Joanna, can you pick up from there?
This is what Leona told us about that. She and Marvin Yoder were both long-term employees at Goodwill, and she remembers that they would take the wheelchair on the stairs, Marvin taking the back and Leona taking the front, and they manually took the wheelchair with the patient in the chair up and down the steps. And on occasion, Marvin would carry a patient on his back up and down the stairs. Just for the record, these transports were all accident-free. There were no accidents. No one was hurt. But can you imagine that kind of thing being allowed today? I think not. Also, Leona worked the night shift for a long time, and those other things she talked about were things that she did as a nursing staff person. And they did these extra things at night, helping with the laundry and so on. I worked there a very short time, just as part-time help when I was home from college. Started in December of '62, and then that next summer when I came home for the summer, I worked part-time. And I found my check stubs the other day. I was paid 50 cents an hour. And of course, Social Security was taken out of that, so my take-home was a little less than that, but was 50 cents an hour. And I don't think I was getting less than the other people who did not have any kind of training. And we helped do partial baths and that kind of thing in the morning before the other staff came on. And I remember helping to fold clothing and so on. But Leona had worked there for so long, and she knew that building better than a lot of people did. And she talked about a furnace alarm that an alarm would go off if the furnace stopped working. And so then it had to be reset when you restarted it. And that happened repeatedly sometimes. and sometimes 4 or 5 times a night, and she was it, she said. I was it. So she had to go downstairs and reset the furnace. That was part of what she did as a night nurse. And then one night, a fire extinguisher or some kind of sprinkler, local sprinkler thing went off, and there was water all over the basement. And Ed Yoder was the maintenance person at the time, and they called finally, I think she tried calling the administrator first, and he was out of town or something, and they got in touch with Ed somehow. The problem was Ed hit a deer on his way to Goodwill, and so he didn't get there, and Leona had to do something. They told Leona to do something, so she took Wanda Beitzel, who was also working, Wanda Yoder now, and they went to the basement, and she had Wanda hold the door open while she went in and reset and turned off the water so that the water would not continue spraying everywhere. So it was, her job entailed quite a bit more than just patient care.
So we know, Joanna, that you worked at Goodwill too, and Lucy, if you can just briefly tell us about your training.
Oh, I had very extensive training. I went in I was called one day, and I was asked to come in at 5 o'clock the next morning to learn the ropes. And so I went in at 5. I worked till 7. I went home. I tried to sleep that day because I had to go back to work that night at 11. So I worked night duty for a while. That was the extent of my training. I worked night duty for a while, and then I was switched to daytime. And I was on baths that first day, and Catherine Miller was the head nurse at the time. And so she showed me how to get this lady into the tub. Didn't have a lift or whatever up there. And then she got called out, and I guess she got busy. Anyway, that was my training.
So Elaine, you started in 1986, and do you mind telling us how much you were getting an hour, about how much?
I had a hard time remembering, but I think it was around $3.50 that I started out.
$3.50 an hour.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And what was different then than now?
Okay, lots of things have changed over the years. When I started out, I started as a nursing assistant. I was trained by the staff with the understanding that I would take the CNA class as soon as it was offered at the college, which I did. Later, we were also trained as geriatric nursing assistants. This was, they really wanted nursing assistants at a nursing home to have that class. So we took that. Later, I was also trained as a med tech, which I gave some meds and treatments under supervision. After my mom had a stroke, I had taken off 2 years to take care of her, but then I went back in 1991, and as an activity assistant part-time and part-time nursing. As an activity assistant, I assisted in planning and leading activities for the residents. But some of the changes that I have seen, when I started, it was very important that residents didn't fall, of course, and if you had a confused resident, we used restraints to make sure they couldn't get up out of a chair or out of the bed or whatever, so they didn't fall. And this was the accepted thing. It was what we were supposed to do. Time went on, and we were not allowed to use restraints anymore. This was a state thing. So then that's why when you go to the nursing home now and you hear little bells and whistles goes off, they are sitting on something that will alert us when they get up. So we're supposed to be there real quick. And that's why we have a memory lane unit, which is contained, so they can't leave there.
Tell us a little bit about the charting yet, and then we need to move on.
Okay, charting has definitely changed from paper charting, which there was a lot of paper charting, to now it's all computerized. And everything gets charted through computers, and I often feel like when I leave that day, the state or anybody that wants to can see everything I did today, because it goes directly to them. But in activities, it's about who attended, what their response was, what type of activity it was. When I worked as a nursing assistant, it was TPRs, blood pressures, fluid intakes, output, food they had eaten, just all kinds of,
Yeah.
it just goes on and
Yeah.
on, but that all gets charted.
Yes.
And there's lots more changes.
Yeah. And they haven't stopped, and they won't,
No.
probably. Time is moving faster than we are here, and we're almost done, folks. So we're here because Joanna turned 80. So I thought now is the time, as we're near the end, for you to talk a little bit about teaching. You retired in 1994. Northern High seniors today would not be familiar with sermon night. Can you tell us about what sermon night was like and some other changes that have been pretty dramatic over the years?
Sermon night was that. It was a church service ahead of graduation. Colleges had it, high schools had it, all over the country. It wasn't only here, but we had church for the seniors, and seniors wore their caps and gowns. And when we went to the high school and had it in the gym, same as we had commencement later, and it would be a day or two ahead of graduation night. Sometimes it was on a Sunday night, but I don't think it always was.
Ours was.
Was it a Sunday? Maybe it would have.
Ours
I think often it was the Sunday before graduation. I'm not sure how that works. I think that was it. And there was a preacher. When I was the senior advisor, we had, the seniors could choose who the minister would be for graduation night. And we kind of tried to move it around. Sometimes we had a Mennonite preacher. One time we did. Often it was a Methodist or Lutheran or whatever. And there would be prayers, public prayers and public sermon and a regular church service. At graduation, there was also an opening prayer, and that, it was expected. And in the school itself, during the school year, we had a Bible study club that some of us were members of when we were students, and then I had a Bible study club, but we had regular devotions on the PA system that went throughout the whole school with a prayer and a short scripture reading that the Bible club members did we went to the office and did it on the PA system. And I found in my diary that one Easter, Lucy Ellen and Martha Maust and I think it was Lucy Ellen Byler and Martha Maust and I sang an Easter song over the PA system as part of the morning devotions. And that was a regular part of the school day. Maybe not every day. I think maybe
But it was
the
a
club had,
regular.
it was like 3 days a week at least, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I think earlier it used to be every day. So that kind of change I'm sure Tim doesn't see that every morning with prayers and scripture reading doesn't hear that on coming over the PA system. A lot of other things changed too. I don't know how the office contacts Tim today when they want anything with you, but the only way they could contact us was either talking through the PA system, just turning on my room, or coming to my door. And there was no such thing as email or texting anyone or all the other ways that they do things now. And we had to do report cards. Everything was done by hand. Your homeroom, you had to write out every student's, the basic information, and then we'd have a place where all the teachers would come together, and you would grab this homeroom and put in the English grades for the people in this homeroom, and then this one, and then in the next grade level. It was nothing, we couldn't all be doing the same set of cards at the same time on the computer. I'm sure things of that nature have changed a great deal.
And the smoking room.
And when I had my planning period, the only place for me to go to make copies or of the next thing I wanted to make copies of, and even how you make copies, things changed a great deal. But the only place I could go was to the faculty room, and that was where the faculty smoked. Students were not allowed to smoke in the classroom. They were not allowed to smoke in the halls. They were not allowed to smoke in the gym. They were not allowed to smoke in the bathrooms, although they did, some of them. But teachers were allowed to smoke in the smoking room for teachers. I would come out of there, and that's where we had to keep our coats too. And I would come out of there at the end of the day reeking of smoke. It was awful. I breathed in so much secondary smoke. It was awful. So I was quite relieved after renovation. We were no longer, and that's where no smoking in places like this was coming across in the state and in the country. And I was so relieved when smoking was no longer allowed on school property. And some of the faculty was quite upset that they had to go to the Overlook to get their smoke at noon, and it could hardly wait to get there.
Two teachers that smoked, and we made them smoke in the furnace room.
Well, there were many more than 2 smokers at Northern when I was teaching, so that
So
was,
what we've heard today is that some things change, but some things don't. A young girl in love preparing for her wedding could be pretty absent-minded. And I want to tell you another cousin story. She's not here today. Edna Bender, Edna Maust she was, in the 60s when she worked up here at Goodwill. And she was in love, and she was thinking about her wedding and all the stuff that goes with it. And she was tasked with taking a lady to the bathroom in the wheelchair. So she goes to the residence room, she goes to the restroom, and gets there and discovers the wheelchair is empty. So she was pretty absent-minded. So before we close, Fannie, I was thinking, you and Ida are the oldest of us sitting here today, and you've seen many changes and many conveniences introduced over time. And there were a couple firsts that you talked about, Fannie, that you remember. Do you remember the 2 firsts? And then my next question would be, what do you see as the most impressive invention of all time?
Well, I think the 2 firsts you're speaking of was my first ice cream cone and my first soda pop. I remember that. I don't know how old I was, but
Who were you with when you got the first ice cream cone?
well, my sister tells me they were with their aunt. I wasn't along that time, but my sister apparently was. And she was
Okay.
with her, your mother, I think she said, right?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the orange soda drink, where,
I went with my dad to the stockyards, and he bought me a soda pop.
and how we take ice cream cones and sodas for granted pretty much, don't we? So when you think about the inventions and the strides that have been made in your time, what seems to you to be the most, one of the most impressive inventions?
Well, I don't need to think twice about that. In my over 80 years, is the electricity. It brought electric to the house. Of course, it brought lights, and no more kerosene lamps, no more milking by hand. It was just a fabulous invention.
And along with that, indoor plumbing, right?
Indoor plumbing, yes, of
Yes.
course. Yeah.
So, no more having to go to the outhouse.
Yeah.
Yes. And that ends our panel discussion, and we would take time, if somebody has a comment to make, or a question to ask, or a memory to share, I think there's a mic somewhere. Mark.
It's up here now, I don't know.
Oh, is it the one that's here on the, you want to get it, Tim, there on the, yeah, does anybody have a question or a comment? If not, that, there's one back there, way back in the back.
Ruth, there's one thing you have not touched on that all of us girl cousins used to play when we would come, when you guys would all come to my house.
So what did you play? I didn't hear what you
Or
said.
do you want to talk
Something
about it?
You're the one that invented it.
Played when they were at their house. She's had it in
I think Lucy would be a good one to tell about that.
I wasn't really sure how it would be seen here today, honestly, because when we played it, we didn't play it with an evil eye to it, but we played what we called witch, and we had made up a game where the witch was the bad person who would kidnap people, and there were certain codes to get free. But I thought nowadays that could seem as if we were being maybe irreverent.
Fancy with the devil.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, let me just say this, there was always a mother and a maid, and in the course of the game, the mother would spank the maid. There was one thing I always tried to avoid. If Ruth was the mother, I did not want to be the maid. She spanked hard.
Ignore that.
I just
Yes, we need the mic up here.
I remember the day that Roosevelt died. It was April 14th, and I think I was 3 years old. And it was evening, and the windows were open, it was a nice day, and we were sitting in a table in the kitchen eating dinner, and we heard the sound trucks down on Beverly Road. We lived in a suburb of Pittsburgh called Mount Lebanon. So we rushed out the door and down the hill, and we stood on the street, and the sound truck came by and said that FDR had died. And that's one thing I remember.
It's amazing, isn't it, how we would get information back then, before all the electronics. Well, we don't want to keep you. We thank you for coming. I think it's been fun to share.
Do you want to invite them to come look at this?
And please feel free to come up and look at the little stuff we have up here, and see if it will jar some memories for you. And otherwise, you are excused. Thank you for coming.